Art has always been an escape for me. When I take my brush in hand, all the chaos of the real world fades away, and I enter that serene universe where only the meaning of colors and lines exists. However, this peaceful escape completely changed when Timur entered my life. My brushstrokes no longer carried only the traces of my inner journey, they were also shaped by Timur's influence. He wasn't just a mentor, he was someone who changed the rhythm of my heart. I first met Timur at a small art gallery in a seaside town. When I attended his exhibition, the admiration I felt while looking at his works was indescribable. The depth in his paintings, the tones he used, the subtle messages in the brush's touch. All of this captivated me. He had torn down all the defenses of my artist identity at once. And then, suddenly, he appeared beside me. When I asked, "Are you the artist of these works?" he smiled and said, "Yes." In that moment, the warmth in his eyes had captured me. Timur was a man who could convey his passion for art in his conversations. That night, we talked throughout the exhibition. I couldn't take my eyes off him while we spoke. There was wisdom in his words, gravity in his demeanor. Above all, I could see how much this man had experienced in life and how he channeled those experiences into his art. He gently invited me, "Would you like to visit my studio? I would love to talk about art." In that moment, I accepted, believing in my artist self. But how could I know that it wouldn't just be an art conversation? Timur's studio was outside of town, on a hill overlooking the sea. When I took my first step through the door, every corner was filled with memories and art pieces he had collected over the years. I felt lost among the colorful paints, half-finished canvases, and various art books. Timur lived in his studio as if it were a temple. And I was proud to be a new visitor to this temple. For a few weeks, we met at the studio. He taught me techniques, color theory, the nuances of brushstrokes. But over time, these lessons became more than just about art. His glances, the examples he gave while speaking, the dance of his hands over the canvases. All of these pulled me into something much more than being an art student. I began to feel his presence inside me. And I realized that my admiration for him wasn't just about his art. Every minute I spent with him sparked something new within me. One evening, as we were leaving the studio, I noticed Timur's eyes were on me. "Melissa," he said. "You have great potential. But beyond that, there's something about you that affects me. It's different, hard to explain." I found myself at a loss for words in that moment. His words surprised me, yet excited me. But this excitement triggered another feeling inside me, guilt. Because I remembered that I was in a relationship. The life I shared with my boyfriend was becoming blurrier with each passing day in Timur's presence. I didn't want to admit that I was under Timur's influence. I tried to convince myself that my admiration for him was simply innocent respect from an artist to her mentor. But with each passing day, I realized that these feelings were far from innocent. I eagerly looked forward to our next meeting, feeling my heart race every time I went to the studio. At some point, even the paintings I made began to change. My colors became bolder, my lines more fluid. When my boyfriend noticed this change, he asked, "You've been doing different things lately, Melissa. What's inspiring you?" I knew the answer, but I couldn't say it aloud. At that moment, I realized that an artist shaped by Timur's influence had been born within me. And this showed that a period had begun in my life that was beyond turning back. Every moment I spent with Timur brought me closer to myself but distanced me from my life. I felt lost in this duality. And deep down, I knew there would be an end to this. But as I moved towards that end, I wanted to see where this journey would take me. Because, at that moment, this feeling was stronger than anything. After those intense evenings in the studio, one day Timur made a different proposal. As we finished our work, he asked, "The weather is lovely, would you like to walk along the shore for a bit?" At that moment, I wanted to believe it was just a simple walk. But a part of my heart knew this offer was not ordinary. "Sure," I said, smiling slightly. As I cleaned my brush, I thought of the night awaiting us outside. The wind along the shore and the sound of waves. Being alone with Timur could feel different in that atmosphere. While we walked along the shore, Timur spoke about art, his life, his past. I, on the other hand, was like a sponge, soaking in every word. The calmness in his voice felt like it was healing a part of me inside. "Life is a canvas that shapes us," he said at one point, gazing softly at the waves. "But sometimes we don't know how to hold the brush. We make wrong strokes. Those mistakes can become the most striking parts of the canvas." His words touched such a deep part of me that I couldn't reply. I just admired the wisdom of the man walking beside me once again. As the wind blew through my hair, I began to get lost in the magic of the moment. Even in his walk, Timur had an elegance unique to him. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Occasionally, he would turn to tell me something, but I was more focused on his presence. I realized that the man walking beside me was not just a mentor, that he filled an inexplicable void in my life. At one point, we reached a dark corner of the shore. There was a bench there. Timur stopped and asked, "Shall we sit for a bit?" I nodded and sat at the edge of the bench. I tried to look far into the distance, but my mind was entirely on Timur. Even his silence echoed within me. For a while, we listened to the sound of the waves without speaking. Then he turned to me and said, "Melissa, talking to you like this feels good to me." There was an unusual emotion in his voice, as if he were struggling to confess something. In that moment, I felt my heart racing. I wanted to say, "It's you who feels good to me," but I was speechless. For a few seconds, it was as if time had stopped. When my eyes met his, I felt the invisible wall between us slowly crumbling. "Timur," I said, but I couldn't continue. My words were incomplete because there was no language to describe what I felt. He silently stood up and sat next to me. The distance between us was completely closed. The salty scent of the sea carried by the wind, the sound of waves echoing in the dark of the night. The entire atmosphere intensified that moment. "Melissa," he said, his voice hushed. "I know this isn't right. But something happens inside me every time I see you, something I can't control." Everything fell apart at that moment. His words had revealed the feelings I had kept hidden. "Me too," I said, my words barely a whisper. "But we shouldn't think about this, right?" Even as I asked myself this question, I didn't want the answer. I knew I couldn't resist this forbidden attraction. Timur gently reached out for my hand. "Yes, we shouldn't think about it," he said, but his voice betrayed his disbelief. Instead of pulling his hand away, his fingers remained intertwined with mine. This small touch seemed to erase all boundaries between us. I knew that what was between us would lead to destruction. But as I sat on that bench, that thought had no meaning. That night, as I walked home along the shore, the turmoil within me took hold. What was happening between Timur and me had become undeniable. When I closed my eyes, his words, his touch, and his presence replayed in my mind. I realized that the life I shared with my boyfriend seemed so dull compared to the excitement and intensity with Timur. But at the same time, I felt the weight of what I was doing. That night was not just a walk. It was a sign that my life would never be the same again. And I carried the excitement and fear of these new emotions within me as I awaited the next meeting with Timur. The exhibition night would be a turning point for me. After weeks of preparation, I finally had the opportunity to showcase the works I created in the hours spent in Timur's studio. That night represented not only my art but also, in some way, the forbidden world I shared with Timur. When I looked at my paintings, I could see how his teachings, what he made me feel, reflected in every brushstroke. But the turmoil I felt inside would stay with me throughout the night. When the gallery began to fill, excitement gave way to tension. Timur had been by my side since the morning, helping to arrange the exhibition. His calmness and support kept me standing in all the chaos. But deep down, I knew that being with Timur in the same environment as my boyfriend could be a recipe for disaster. That night, I had felt that two separate worlds in my life would collide. As the first guests arrived, my boyfriend appeared at the door. He approached me with a bouquet of flowers in hand. "Melissa, I'm so proud of you," he said. There was a genuine love in his eyes. In that moment, my heart clenched even more. His pure trust in me made the guilt inside me unbearable. But I couldn't show what I was feeling at that moment. I just smiled and accepted the flowers. "Thank you," I said, my voice slightly trembling. Timur, on the other hand, was at the other corner of the gallery, talking to people and discussing the paintings. But from time to time, I noticed that his gaze was on me. His silent presence made moments with my boyfriend even harder. I felt trapped among the crowd. As my boyfriend held my arm and tried to introduce me to guests, my mind wandered to Timur. Feeling caught between these two men almost took my breath away. As the exhibition progressed, I tried to prevent my boyfriend and Timur from crossing paths. But it was inevitable. At one point, Timur approached us. "Melissa, congratulations," he said warmly. When he came face to face with my boyfriend, he smiled slightly and extended his hand. "I'm Timur," he said. My boyfriend shook his hand politely and replied, "I'm Melissa's boyfriend." At that moment, I tried to ignore the expression in his eyes, but I felt that something had changed. The brief silence between them felt like the beginning of a storm. Later in the evening, my boyfriend and I pulled aside to a quiet corner. His eyes had been on me for some time. "Melissa," he said, his voice a bit sharper. "Is there something between you and Timur? Because the way he looks at you," he trailed off before finishing his sentence. My heart was pounding. In that moment, I wanted to deny it. But when I looked at his expression, I realized it was impossible to hide the truth. "It's not true," I said, my voice trembling. But my words weren't convincing. I averted my eyes, and I saw the disappointment in his gaze. Without another word, he turned and left the gallery. As my boyfriend walked out, a storm broke inside me. Timur had noticed something was wrong. He came over and asked, "What happened?" His voice was concerned. My eyes were filled with tears, but I couldn't say anything. Words were not enough to explain the turmoil inside me. In that moment, I realized that I had to face the consequences of everything I had done. I turned to Timur and looked into his eyes. "This can't go on like this," I said. "We both made a mistake. And we have to pay for it." Timur paused for a moment. Then he bowed his head and silently nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but sorrowful. In that moment, I knew he also understood that our relationship was a dead end. But accepting it would not be easy for either of us. This bond between us was not just an excitement or a mistake. It was a story that had changed us, shaped us. When the exhibition ended that night, I was the only one left. The gallery was empty, the lights were off, and everything was silent. I found myself among my paintings. Each piece reflected the turmoil I had lived through. The passion in my brushstrokes was no longer just about my art but also belonged to the turmoil in my life. What I experienced with Timur had changed me. But it had also ruined me. Feeling the weight of the choices I had made in my life, I left the gallery. As I walked along the shore, the sound of the waves echoed inside me. That night, everything had ended. But the marks Timur left would stay with me for a lifetime.